The champagne hadn't even gone flat yet. The room still smelled like confetti spray, and I still had icing on my shirt collar from the cake that had my name on it. They were clapping for me until they weren't. I built our department from the ground up. 500% growth in 18 months, during a recession, and 2 hours later, I was out. Replaced by someone who'd never opened a spreadsheet in his life because his last name matched the CEO's. The conference room at our Denver headquarters looked like a festival had exploded inside it. Orange and white balloons, corporate colors bobbed against the ceiling, their ribbons trailing down like party streamers that had given up trying to stay upright. Someone from HR had gone overboard with the decorations, transforming our usual sterile meeting space into something that belonged at a kid's birthday party rather than a Fortune 500 company. The centerpiece was impossible to miss: a massive sheet cake with 500% growth written in bold chocolate letters across white frosting. It sat on the mahogany conference table like a sugary monument to everything I'd accomplished over the past 3 years, my sleepless nights, my sacrificed weekends and missed family dinners. I was Ethan Keller, 38 years old, head of marketing for Langford Industries. 3 years of my life had gone into building this department from nothing. When I started, we had 2 employees, including myself, and a budget that wouldn't cover a decent laptop. Now we had a team of 15, our own floor in the building, and numbers that made other departments look like they were standing still. The growth hadn't come easy. I'd worked Christmas Eve while my wife Sarah took the kids to her mother's alone. I'd skipped Thanksgiving dinner to finish quarterly projections that couldn't wait until Monday. I'd turned down job offers from competitors because I believed in what we were building here. I believed in loyalty. I believed that hard work and results would speak for themselves. Martin Langford, our CEO, stood at the head of the table with his arms spread wide like he was about to deliver a sermon. At 52, he had that distinguished silver hair thing, going, perfectly styled, expensive suit, the kind of presence that made boardrooms go quiet when he walked in. He'd been patting my shoulder for the past 10 minutes, telling everyone within earshot about my genius strategy and how I'd revolutionized their approach to market penetration. "Ethan here," Martin said, his voice carrying that executive boom that filled rooms, "has shown us what real leadership looks like, what dedication looks like, what results look like." The applause started again, and I felt that familiar surge of pride mixed with exhaustion. This was it. This had to be it. The promotion to vice president that had been dangling in front of me for over a year, the one Martin kept hinting at during our monthly reviews. Big things coming, Ethan. Big things. Today felt like the day those big things would finally materialize. I'd even practiced my acceptance speech in the car on the way to work. Nothing too elaborate, just a few words about teamwork and gratitude and commitment to continued growth. Sarah had helped me pick out my lucky tie, the navy blue one with tiny silver dots that she said brought out my eyes. "Now," Martin continued, his smile growing wider, "as we celebrate this incredible milestone, I want to talk about the future, about where we go from here." The room went quiet. This was it. I straightened my shoulders, ready to step into the role I'd been working toward since day one. "Growth like this requires fresh perspectives," Martin said. "New energy, young blood to take us to the next level." Something cold settled in my stomach. Fresh perspectives? I'd just delivered the freshest perspectives possible: 500% growth in a recession. What could be fresher than that? The conference room door opened. Cameron Langford walked in wearing a Gucci suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. At 24, he had his father's height, but none of his presence. His suit jacket hung awkwardly on his shoulders like he'd grabbed it off the rack 5 minutes before the meeting. His hair was perfectly styled in that effortless way that took an hour and a professional to achieve. He moved with the casual confidence of someone who'd never had to prove himself to anyone. "Everyone," Martin's voice boomed with paternal pride. "I'd like you to meet your new head of marketing, Cameron Langford." The room erupted in polite applause, but it sounded different now. Forced. Uncomfortable. I could see my team exchanging glances, their expressions carefully neutral in that way people master when they work in corporate environments long enough. Cameron waved like he was accepting an award at a film festival. "Thanks, everyone. I'm really excited to be here and to work with such a talented team. His voice was smooth, practiced. He sounded like every other privileged kid who'd coasted through business school on his family's reputation. I'd heard that tone before in conference rooms full of consultants who charged astronomical fees to tell you things you already knew. Ethan. Martin turned to me with that same broad smile. Cameron's going to need your help with the transition. I know I can count on you to show him the ropes. Show him the ropes. The ropes I'd spent 3 years learning, tying and climbing. The ropes that had just been cut out from under me while I was still hanging on. I didn't cry. I didn't shout. I didn't flip the conference table or storm out of the room like some part of me wanted to. I just stood there, feeling the weight of every missed family dinner, every late night, every weekend I'd sacrificed for this company settling on my shoulders like a lead blanket. Of course, I heard myself say, whatever you need. The cake suddenly looked obscene sitting there with my achievements spelled out in chocolate letters that were probably already melting under the conference room lights. The balloons seemed to mock me, their cheerful colors a stark contrast to the numbness spreading through my chest. My phone buzzed against my leg. A text from Jessica in HR. Call me ASAP. Need to talk. I didn't call her. I knew what she wanted to talk about. Severance packages, COBRA benefits, the corporate equivalent of a consolation prize for getting stabbed in the back at your own celebration. Instead, I excused myself from the party that was no longer mine and walked back to my office. My office that would probably be Cameron's office by the end of the week. I sat down at my desk and opened my laptop, my fingers moving automatically across the keyboard. Project Snowcap. That's what I'd called it. 5 months of careful documentation, screenshots, and saved emails. 5 months of watching Martin Langford systematically manipulate numbers, inflate projections, and lie to our biggest client. It had started small. A percentage here, a forecast there. Nothing that would raise red flags individually, but I'd been paying attention. I'd been watching, and I'd been documenting everything. Kingswell Group was our largest client, accounting for 45% of our revenue. Russell Kingswell, their CEO, trusted Martin implicitly. They'd been college roommates, old friends who'd built their careers in parallel. Russell believed every number Martin fed him, every projection, every growth promise. The problem was, most of those numbers were fiction. I'd discovered it by accident 3 months ago while preparing a presentation for Russell's quarterly review. The numbers in Martin's deck didn't match the raw data from our analytics platform. When I dug deeper, I found a pattern of systematic inflation. Revenue projections bumped up by 15-20%. Conversion rates that existed only in Martin's presentations. Market share claims that would have made our competitors laugh if they'd known how far off they were. At first, I'd thought it was a mistake, then I'd thought about bringing it up with Martin directly, but something had held me back. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was the way Martin's eyes went cold whenever someone questioned his numbers in meetings. Maybe it was the memory of what happened to Derek from operations when he'd pushed back on a quarterly forecast last year. Derek, who'd suddenly found himself restructured out of his position 3 weeks later. So I'd kept quiet, and I'd kept documenting. Email screenshots, internal presentations with the real numbers alongside Martin's doctored versions. Analytics reports that showed the actual performance versus what we were reporting to Kingswell. 5 months of evidence that painted a clear picture of systematic fraud. I'd told myself I was being paranoid, that I was collecting insurance I'd never need to use, that Martin might be optimistic with his projections, but he wasn't actually committing fraud. Until today. Until I'd watched him replace me with his unqualified son while praising the very growth I'd achieved through the legitimate means. Growth that had been inflated and misrepresented to our biggest client for months. Now, Project Snowcap didn't feel like paranoia. It felt like justice waiting to happen. I pulled up Russell Kingswell's contact information. We'd met dozens of times over the years, usually in meetings where Martin did most of the talking while I presented the actual work. Russell was sharp, demanding, and absolutely ruthless when it came to business relationships. He'd built Kingswell Group from a small regional firm into a national powerhouse by making smart decisions and cutting ties with anyone who couldn't deliver results. He was also, I'd learned from years of working with him, someone who valued honesty and competence above all else. He'd once told me during a break in a strategy session that he'd rather work with someone who delivered bad news honestly than someone who sugarcoated problems until they became disasters. I composed an email carefully, professionally, with just enough information to spark his interest without seeming desperate or vindictive. Russell, I hope this message finds you well. I wanted to reach out regarding some concerns I have about the reporting accuracy in our recent presentations to Kingswell Group. I believe we should discuss this in person at your earliest convenience. I have some information that I think you'll find very relevant to your upcoming strategic planning session. Would you be available for coffee sometime this week? Best regards, Ethan. I hit send before I could second-guess myself. Then I closed my laptop, straightened my tie, the lucky one that hadn't turned out to be so lucky after all, and walked back toward the conference room where my former colleagues were still celebrating my replacement. Cameron was holding court near the cake, gesturing animatedly while describing his vision for the department's future. He was using buzzwords like synergy and paradigm shifts and innovative disruption, the kind of empty corporate speak that consultants used when they didn't actually understand the business they were consulting on. My team was listening with polite attention, but I could see the skepticism in their eyes. These were people who'd worked nights and weekends to hit our numbers. They knew what real results looked like, and they could spot bullshit from across the room. "Ethan," Cameron called out when he saw me. Perfect timing. I was just telling everyone about my plans to leverage our existing infrastructure to maximize our ROI through strategic realignment. I nodded and smiled like those words meant something. Sounds exciting. I'm thinking we should schedule a deep dive session for next week. Really get into the weeds on our current processes and identify optimization opportunities. A deep dive session. This kid wanted to spend a week learning what I'd spent 3 years building so he could take credit for it and probably mess it up in the process. Absolutely, I said. Whatever you need to get up to speed. My phone buzzed. A response from Russell, sent from his iPhone. Free for lunch tomorrow. Chapel and Vine, 12:30. Bring whatever you think I need to see. Chapel and Vine was Russell's favorite restaurant, an upscale place downtown where he conducted most of his important business meals. The kind of place where deals were made and partnerships were born or destroyed. I typed back quickly. See you there. The rest of the party passed in a blur of forced conversations and fake smiles. People congratulated Cameron on his new role while shooting me sympathetic looks when they thought he wasn't watching. Martin made a toast about new beginnings and exciting transitions that made my stomach turn. When it was finally over, I went back to my office and started organizing my files. Not just the official handover documents that HR would require, but my own personal backup of everything I'd built: client contact lists, strategy documents, performance metrics, project timelines, and Project Snowcap. Every screenshot, every email, every piece of evidence that showed exactly how Martin had been manipulating the numbers he'd been feeding to Russell Kingswell for months. I worked until almost midnight, long after the cleaning crew had finished their rounds and the building had settled into its after hours. Quiet. By the time I finally locked my office and headed to the parking garage, I had everything I needed. The drive home was quiet. Sarah was already asleep when I got there, but she'd left a plate of dinner covered in plastic wrap on the kitchen counter with a note. Congratulations on your big day. Can't wait to hear all about it. Love you. I stared at that note for a long time, thinking about how I was going to explain that my big day had turned into the day I got replaced by a 24-year-old who thought ROI was a foreign word you pronounced with a French accent. Instead, I ate my cold dinner in the dark kitchen and planned exactly what I was going to say to Russell Kingswell tomorrow. The next morning, I dressed carefully. My best suit, the one Sarah had insisted I buy for important presentations, conservative tie, polished shoes, briefcase instead of my usual laptop bag. I wanted to look like someone Russell could trust, someone who took serious business seriously. Chapel and Vine occupied the top floor of a downtown high-rise with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the city. Russell had reserved his usual corner table, the one that provided privacy for sensitive conversations while still allowing him to see everyone who entered the restaurant. He was already there when I arrived, reviewing something on his tablet while nursing what looked like his second cup of coffee. At 48, Russell had the kind of lean, focused energy that successful entrepreneurs develop after years of making decisions that affect thousands of jobs and millions of dollars. His handshake was firm, his attention complete. "Ethan," he said as I sat down across from him, "you sounded concerned in your email. What's going on?" I'd rehearsed this conversation during my drive downtown, but sitting across from Russell in person made everything feel more real, more consequential. Once I opened this door, there would be no closing it. "I need to show you something," I said, pulling out my laptop. "Something about the numbers Martin's been presenting to you." Russell's expression didn't change, but his posture shifted slightly. He'd been relaxed, casual. Now he was alert, focused in the way that predators focus when they catch an interesting scent. I opened the first document, a side-by-side comparison of Martin's presentation to Russell from last quarter, alongside the actual analytics data from our internal systems. "This is the revenue projection Martin showed you in September," I said, pointing to the left side of the screen, "and this is what our actual performance data showed for the same period." Russell studied the numbers for a long moment. The difference wasn't subtle. Martin's projection showed 34% growth. The actual data showed 18% growth. Still respectable, still above industry averages, but nowhere near what had been promised. "How long has this been going on?" Russell asked quietly. I clicked to the next document, then the next. 5 months of carefully documented discrepancies. Revenue inflated by an average of 20%. Market share claims that were pure fiction. Conversion rates that existed only in Martin's imagination. "This is comprehensive," Russell said after I'd walked him through the entire presentation. His voice was calm, controlled, but I could see the anger building behind his eyes. "You've been documenting this for months." I started noticing inconsistencies about 5 months ago. I said, "At first, I thought it might be accidental. Different reporting methods, maybe some confusion about which metrics we were using, but the pattern was too consistent." "Why didn't you bring this to Martin's attention directly?" It was the question I'd been dreading, because the honest answer made me look like either a coward or a schemer. Maybe both. "I was afraid," I said. "Martin doesn't respond well to being questioned. I've seen what happens to people who push back on his numbers." Russell nodded slowly. He'd worked with Martin long enough to understand exactly what I meant. "There's something else," I said. "Yesterday, Martin announced that he was replacing me as head of marketing with his son, Cameron, the kid who just graduated from business school." "That's the one." This happened at a celebration for the 500% growth I'd achieved for the department. Martin praised my work, called me a genius, then immediately announced that I was being replaced by someone with no experience and no qualifications beyond his last name. Russell leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. We sat in silence for several minutes while he processed everything I'd shown him. "What do you want from me, Ethan?" he finally asked. This was the moment, the point of no return. "I'm starting my own company." I said, "Keller and North Strategies. I want to focus on strategic growth consulting for select clients who value honesty and results over relationships and politics." I pulled out a business card I'd had printed that morning. Simple, elegant, professional. "I'd like Kingswell Group to be my first client." Russell took the card, studied it for a moment, then slipped it into his jacket pocket. "You're not asking me to decide right now," he observed. "No. I'm giving you information you need to make informed decisions about your business partnerships. What you do with that information is up to you." Russell smiled for the first time since I'd started showing him the numbers. "You know Martin's going to want to schedule a transition meeting, introduce me to his son, reassure me that the account is in good hands." "I'm sure he will. And you'll be there for that meeting, won't you? To help with the transition?" "If that's what Martin wants, then yes." Russell's smile widened. "This should be interesting." We finished lunch discussing industry trends and market conditions, carefully avoiding any further mention of Martin or the documents I'd shown him. To anyone watching, we looked like two business associates having a routine meal. Russell paid the check, shook my hand professionally, and we parted ways in the restaurant lobby. I spent the rest of the week going through the motions, training Cameron on systems he didn't understand, introducing him to clients who clearly had doubts about his capabilities, and pretending that everything was normal while my world quietly shifted around me. Cameron, to his credit, seemed to grasp that he was in over his head. He asked decent questions and took notes during our sessions, though his questions revealed just how little he understood about the business fundamentals. He knew the theory from his MBA classes, but he'd never actually built a marketing strategy from scratch or managed a budget or dealt with a client who was threatening to walk because their expectations weren't being met. This is more complex than I expected, he admitted during one of our training sessions. In school, they made it sound like marketing was just about identifying target demographics and choosing the right channels. School teaches you the framework, I said, but every client is different. Every market is different. You learn by doing, making mistakes, and figuring out what works. How long did it take you to get comfortable with all of this? I'm still learning, I said honestly. The market changes constantly. Client needs evolve. What worked last year might not work next year. You have to stay flexible. He seemed to appreciate the honesty, which made me feel slightly guilty about what was coming. Cameron might be unqualified, and he might owe his position to nepotism, but he wasn't malicious. He was just a kid who'd been thrown into a situation he wasn't prepared for. But that didn't change the fact that I'd spent 3 years building something that was being handed to him without merit. It didn't change the lies Martin had been telling Russell Kingswell, and it didn't change the fact that I deserved better than being replaced at my own celebration. The call came on Thursday afternoon, Martin's assistant, requesting that I attend a lunch meeting on Friday at Chapel and Vine. Martin, Cameron, and Russell Kingswell, the official transition meeting. Russell specifically requested that you be there, she said. He wants to ensure continuity during the leadership change. I agreed to attend. Of course, what else could I do? Friday morning, I dressed carefully again. The same suit I'd worn to my meeting with Russell, but this time with a different tie. The red one Sarah had given me for Christmas, the one she said made me look powerful. Chapel and Vine looked exactly the same as it had earlier in the week, but the atmosphere felt completely different. Martin and Cameron were already at the table when I arrived, both looking relaxed and confident. Martin was in his element, the successful CEO introducing his heir apparent to an important client. Cameron looked nervous, but determined, probably running through the talking points he'd memorized. Russell arrived 5 minutes later, his expression neutral and professional. He greeted Martin warmly, shook Cameron's hand with polite interest, and nodded to me like we were casual acquaintances rather than co-conspirators. Russell, Martin said after we'd all ordered, I wanted to give you a chance to meet Cameron properly and discuss how we're going to maintain the exceptional service you've come to expect from Langford Industries. I appreciate that. Martin, continuity is always important in business relationships. Cameron launched into what was clearly a prepared presentation about his background, his vision for the department, and his commitment to maintaining the high standards that had made the partnership successful. He was more polished than I'd expected, hitting the right notes about client service and results-driven strategies. Russell listened politely, asking a few routine questions about Cameron's experience and his plans for the department. Nothing challenging, nothing that would put anyone on the defensive. Just the kind of due diligence questions that any responsible client would ask. Then, just as our entrees arrived, Russell set down his fork and looked directly at Martin. I'm afraid I have some difficult news to share, he said, his voice calm and professional. Kingswell Group has decided to terminate our contract with Langford Industries, effective immediately. The silence that followed was deafening. Martin's face went through several color changes in rapid succession, settling on a deep red that suggested his blood pressure had just spiked into dangerous territory. I don't understand, Martin said carefully. Has there been some kind of problem with our service? Because if there's an issue, I'm sure we can address it. The issue, Russell said, is trust. I've recently learned that the performance data you've been providing doesn't match your actual results. The revenue projections, the growth metrics, the market share claims, all of it has been systematically inflated for months. Cameron looked confused, his eyes darting between his father and Russell like he was trying to follow a conversation in a foreign language. But Martin's expression had shifted from confusion to something that looked like panic. Russell, I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding. Our numbers are solid. Our growth is real. I can show you the reports. I've seen the reports. Martin, I've also seen the actual data, the real analytics, the genuine performance metrics, the numbers that weren't doctored for client presentations. Russell's voice remained calm, but there was an edge to it now that made the air in the restaurant feel thin. I don't know what you think you've seen, Martin said, but I can assure you that our reporting has been completely accurate. Can you? Russell reached into his briefcase and pulled out a folder. Because I have documentation that suggests otherwise. Screenshots of your internal analytics platform showing actual performance alongside the inflated numbers you presented to me. Email conversations about adjusting projections for client presentation. 5 months of systematic fraud. Martin's face had gone from red to pale, but his jaw was set in that stubborn way I'd seen in meetings when someone challenged his authority. Where did you get this information? He demanded. Russell smiled. Does it matter? The information is accurate, isn't it? The silence stretched for what felt like hours. Cameron was staring at his father with growing understanding and horror. Martin was trying to calculate his next move, probably running through legal implications and damage control strategies. Furthermore, Russell continued, I've decided to begin working with Keller and North Strategies, effective immediately. I believe Ethan's approach to honest reporting and transparent communication aligns better with Kingswell Group's values. That's when Martin's composure finally cracked. You son of a bitch, he said, turning to me with genuine fury. You ungrateful, backstabbing piece of shit. After everything I've done for you, after the opportunities I've given you. Every conversation in the restaurant stopped. Servers paused mid-stride. Other diners turned to stare at the executive having a meltdown at the corner table. Martin, Russell said quietly, you might want to lower your voice. But Martin was beyond caring about appearances. 3 years of manipulated numbers, decades of getting his way through intimidation and politics, and now the sudden realization that his house of cards was collapsing had pushed him past the breaking point. This is industrial espionage, he said, his voice shaking with rage. Corporate theft. I'll have you arrested. I'll sue you for everything you have. You'll sue me for what? I asked calmly. For documenting the fraud you've been committing? For providing accurate information to a client you've been lying to? Those were internal documents, proprietary information. Those were screenshots of lies you've been telling, and I took them from systems I had legitimate access to as part of my job responsibilities. Russell stood up from the table. I think this conversation is over. Martin, my legal team will be in touch about the contract termination. There may be some additional discussions about misrepresentation and fraud. He turned to Cameron, who still looked like he was trying to process what was happening. Cameron, I'm sorry you got caught up in this. You seem like a decent kid. My advice is to distance yourself from this situation as much as possible. Then he turned to me. Ethan, I'll have my team contact you early next week to discuss the terms of our new partnership. He left a $100 bill on the table and walked out of the restaurant, leaving the three of us sitting in the wreckage of what had been Martin's carefully constructed world. Cameron was the first to speak. Dad, is what he said true about the numbers? Martin didn't answer. He was staring at me with a mixture of hatred and disbelief, like he couldn't quite comprehend how someone he'd considered beneath his notice had managed to destroy everything he'd built. You have no idea what you've done, he said finally. No idea what this is going to cost. I know exactly what I've done, I replied. I've given an honest client honest information about the lies he was being told. This will destroy the company, hundreds of jobs, people's livelihoods. No, your fraud will destroy the company. I just made sure Russell found out about it before he invested even more money based on numbers that don't exist. Cameron was looking back and forth between us like he was watching a tennis match played with grenades. I still don't understand, he said. What numbers? What fraud? Martin finally looked at his son, and I saw something in his expression that might have been shame. Or maybe just the realization that his carefully maintained facade was crumbling in front of the one person whose opinion he actually cared about. It's complicated, he said. No, it's not. I said, your father has been lying to our biggest client for months, inflating performance numbers, making up growth projections, claiming results that never happened. And when I documented the lies and brought them to the client's attention, I became the villain. Cameron sat back in his chair like he'd been physically pushed. Jesus, Dad, is that true? Martin didn't answer, which was answer enough. I stood up from the table. I'll clean out my office this afternoon. HR can handle the paperwork. Wait, Cameron said, what happens now? What am I supposed to do? I almost felt sorry for him. 24 years old, handed a job he wasn't qualified for, and now discovering that the family business was built on lies. Learn the real numbers, I said. Figure out what the department actually accomplished versus what your father claimed it accomplished, and start looking for a new job, because this company probably won't exist in 6 months. I left them sitting at the table, Martin staring into his untouched lunch and Cameron looking like his world had just collapsed, which, I suppose, it had. The next few days were a blur of activity. Russell's legal team moved fast, terminating the Kingswell contract and demanding an audit of all previous reporting. Other clients started asking questions when word got out about the Kingswell situation. Martin hired a crisis management firm and a team of lawyers, but the damage was already spreading faster than they could contain it. I spent the weekend setting up Keller and North strategies. Sarah had been shocked when I told her what had happened, but she'd supported my decision completely. I'm proud of you, she said. I know it wasn't easy to speak up, but you did the right thing. I hope so. This could get ugly. Let it get ugly. You built something incredible at that company. If Martin wants to destroy it with his lies, that's his choice. But you don't have to go down with his ship. By Monday, I had an office space rented, business cards printed, and a website under construction. Russell's team had already sent over a preliminary contract for consulting services, along with a referral to 2 other companies that might be interested in working with someone who prioritized honest reporting over creative accounting. Martin called me 17 times that week. I didn't answer any of them. The 18th time, I picked up, Ethan, thank God, we need to talk. No, we don't. Yes, we do. This situation has gotten out of hand, but we can fix it. I'm prepared to make you an offer. I'm not interested in any offer you might make. You haven't heard it yet. VP position, like we discussed. Double your current salary. Stock options. Your own budget. Your own team. Complete autonomy over the marketing department. I dreamed about an offer like that for 3 years. 3 years ago, it would have sounded like everything I'd ever wanted. No, I said, triple your salary, executive VP, a seat on the board of directors. No. There was a long pause. When Martin spoke again, his voice had gone cold. You're making a mistake. Ethan, a big mistake. I made you. I gave you opportunities you never would have had anywhere else. And this is how you repay me? You didn't make me, Martin. I made me. I earned every promotion, every success, every bit of recognition through my own work. The only thing you gave me was a chance to prove what I could do. Without me, you're nothing. Without this company, you have no credibility, no reputation, no client base. We'll see about that. I can destroy you. One phone call to the right people, and you'll never work in this industry again. You can try, but I have something you don't have anymore. What's that? The truth. And clients are going to find out that the truth is a lot more valuable than whatever you've been selling them. He hung up on me. 2 days later, his lawyers called, threatening to sue me for breach of contract, theft of proprietary information, and corporate espionage. I forwarded their letter to my attorney, who laughed when he read it. They've got nothing, he said. You documented fraud committed by your employer using systems you had legitimate access to. You reported that fraud to the victim. If anyone's going to get sued here, it's going to be Martin Langford. The local business press picked up the story the following week. Marketing executive exposes fraud at former company. The article was fair but devastating, laying out the timeline of events and quoting several unnamed sources who confirmed that Martin's numbers had seemed too good to be true for months. Langford Industries' stock price dropped 13% the day the article was published. I got 4 new client inquiries that same day. Over the next 2 weeks, 5 more of Martin's clients terminated their contracts. 3 of them reached out to me about potential consulting arrangements. Martin's lawyers sent increasingly desperate cease and desist letters, but there was nothing to cease and nothing to desist from. I wasn't stealing clients, I was earning them by providing the honest service they weren't getting from Langford Industries. The end came faster than anyone expected. 6 weeks after the Chapel and Vine lunch, Langford Industries filed for bankruptcy protection. The SEC had opened an investigation into Martin's business practices. Several former employees had come forward with additional evidence of fraudulent reporting. The house of cards had finally collapsed completely. I was in my new office when Cameron showed up. He looked older than he had a month and a half earlier, like he'd aged years in the space of weeks. His expensive suit had been replaced with jeans and a button-down shirt. He was carrying a laptop bag that looked like it had seen better days. "I brought you something," he said, setting the bag on my desk. Inside was a USB drive and a stack of printed documents. "What is this?" "Everything," Cameron said. "Dad's offshore accounts, the slush funds, the shell companies he used to hide money from the IRS. There are contracts with vendors that don't exist, payments to consultants who never did any work, money moving through accounts in 3 different countries." I stared at the documents. "Why are you giving me this?" "Because you were right. About the fraud, about the lies, about everything. And because I never knew. I swear to God, Ethan, I never knew what he was doing. Even if that's true, why bring this to me?" Cameron sat down in the chair across from my desk. "Because you're the only person who's been telling the truth about any of this, and because I want to make sure he doesn't get away with it. This will destroy him completely. You understand that, don't you? He destroyed himself. I'm just making sure the people he hurt have a chance to get some justice." I looked through the documents. They were devastating. Years of systematic fraud, tax evasion, and corporate theft. The kind of evidence that would put Martin in federal prison for a very long time. "What are you going to do now?" I asked. "I don't know. Maybe go back to school. Maybe try to find a job somewhere that my last name isn't a liability. Maybe change my last name." "For what it's worth," I said. "I think you're doing the right thing. It takes courage to turn against family, even when family is wrong." Cameron nodded, but he didn't look like he felt courageous. He looked like someone who'd watched his entire world collapse and was trying to figure out how to build something new from the wreckage. "Will you use it?" he asked, gesturing toward the USB drive. "The evidence?" "I'll turn it over to the right people. The SEC investigators, the federal prosecutors. They'll know what to do with it." "Good." He stood up to leave, then paused at the door. "Ethan, I'm sorry. For what happened to you, for what my father did. You deserved better." "Thank you," I said. "That means something." After he left, I sat in my office for a long time, staring at the USB drive. Such a small thing to contain so much destruction. But Cameron was right. This wasn't about destruction anymore. This was about justice. I called the lead investigator on the SEC case and arranged to turn over the additional evidence. Then I called a contact at the Business Chronicle, an investigative reporter who'd been following white-collar crime for 20 years. "I have something you might find interesting," I said. The story broke 3 days later on the front page of the Business Chronicle. "Executive son exposes father's massive fraud scheme." The article detailed everything Martin's offshore accounts, the shell companies, the fake contracts, the tax evasion. It painted a picture of systematic corruption that went far beyond inflated marketing numbers. The federal prosecutors moved quickly. Martin was arrested at his home on a Tuesday morning, charged with wire fraud, tax evasion, and money laundering. The judge denied bail, citing flight risk and the discovery of a passport with a false name in Martin's safe. The trial lasted 3 months. I testified for 2 days, walking the jury through the marketing fraud that had started everything. Cameron testified for 4 days, explaining how he'd discovered his father's more extensive criminal activities and why he'd decided to come forward. Martin's defense team tried to paint me as a disgruntled employee seeking revenge, and Cameron as a naive kid who'd been manipulated by prosecutors. But the evidence was overwhelming. 23 separate counts of fraud, involving over $15 million in stolen funds. The jury deliberated for 6 hours, guilty on all counts. Martin Langford was sentenced to 14 years in federal prison. 6 months later, Keller and North Strategies had grown to 12 employees and was being featured in business magazines as one of the fastest-growing consulting firms on the West Coast. We'd developed a reputation for brutal honesty and exceptional results, a combination that turned out to be exactly what clients wanted after years of dealing with consultants who told them what they wanted to hear rather than what they needed to know. I hired back most of my old team from Langford Industries. They'd all been laid off when the company finally collapsed, but they were eager to work for someone they trusted again. We built our company culture around transparency, integrity, and the radical idea that clients deserved the truth about their business performance, even when the truth was uncomfortable. Russell Kingswell became more than just our first client. He became our biggest advocate. His referrals accounted for nearly 30% of our new business in our first year. Working with Ethan, he told a reporter, is like finally getting glasses after years of trying to read without them. Everything just becomes clear. Sarah was proud of what we'd built, but she was prouder of how we'd built it. "You could have taken the easy road," she said one evening as we watched the sunset from our new deck. We'd been able to buy a bigger house in a better neighborhood, but more importantly, we'd been able to do it honestly. "You could have kept quiet about Martin's fraud, taken Cameron's job, and coasted on the reputation you'd built. Instead, you risked everything to do what was right." "It didn't feel like risk at the time," I said. "It felt like the only choice I had." That's what makes it brave. When doing the right thing feels like the only option, even when it's the hardest option. I'd kept Martin's business card in my desk drawer, the one he'd given me on my first day at Langford Industries. On the back, he'd written, "Results matter more than methods." I'd thought it was inspirational at the time. Now I understood it was a warning about the kind of man I was working for. I threw the card away on the anniversary of the day I'd been replaced at my own celebration. It felt symbolic, like closing a chapter that had taken too long to end. Cameron found a job at a nonprofit focused on corporate ethics and whistleblower protection. He'd changed his last name to his mother's maiden name and was slowly building a reputation based on his own work rather than his family connections. We exchanged Christmas cards and occasionally met for coffee when he was in town on business. He was becoming the kind of man his father could have been, if his father had chosen integrity over shortcuts. I got a letter from Martin about 2 years into his sentence. It was handwritten on prison stationery, the kind of cheap paper that felt rough between your fingers. He didn't apologize for the fraud or acknowledge the damage he'd caused. Instead, he wrote about how proud he'd been of my work, how much potential he'd seen in me, how disappointed he was that I'd chosen revenge over loyalty. I read the letter twice, then filed it away without responding. Martin still didn't understand that I hadn't chosen revenge. I'd chosen truth. The revenge had just been a side effect. But it was satisfying revenge, I had to admit. Every time a new client signed with us because they valued honest reporting over creative accounting, it felt like another small victory. Every time a former Langford Industries employee told me how much better they felt about their work now that they weren't being asked to participate in lies, it felt like vindication. The best revenge, though, was simpler than all of that. It was walking into my office every morning knowing that I'd built something legitimate. Something that would last because it was based on real value rather than manipulation and fraud. Something I could be proud of without reservations or asterisks. Revenge isn't about destruction. It's about building something so great they have no choice but to watch. I'd learned that lesson the hard way, in a conference room decorated with balloons and cake while being replaced by someone whose only qualification was sharing DNA with the CEO. But I'd learned it completely. And if you've ever been replaced by someone who didn't earn it, if you've ever watched your achievements get handed to someone else like party favors, if you've ever been told that your years of hard work matter less than someone else's connections, you're not alone. And you can still win. Sometimes the best victory isn't getting your old job back. Sometimes it's building something so much better that your old job looks like the consolation prize. Sometimes the best response to being undervalued isn't to prove your worth to people who refuse to see it. Sometimes it's to find people who recognize excellence when they see it. And sometimes the best answer to betrayal isn't forgiveness or forgetting. Sometimes it's succeeding so completely that the betrayal becomes the best thing that ever happened to you. 3 years after that celebration party that ended with my replacement, I was standing in our new conference room overlooking the city skyline. Keller and North had just signed our biggest contract yet, a 3-year partnership with a Fortune 100 company that had specifically sought us out because of our reputation for honest reporting. My team was celebrating with champagne and catered lunch from the same restaurant where Martin had tried to intimidate me into silence. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. "Speech," someone called out, and the room went quiet. I looked around at the faces of people who'd chosen to work with me because they believed in what we were building. People who'd left comfortable jobs at established firms because they wanted to be part of something authentic. 3 years ago, I said, I thought success meant getting recognition from people who didn't deserve to give it. I thought it meant climbing a ladder that someone else had built. I thought it meant playing by rules that were designed to keep me in my place. I raised my glass. I was wrong. Success means building your own ladder. Success means making your own rules. Success means creating something so valuable that the people who once overlooked you have no choice but to respect what you've accomplished. The toast was loud and genuine, the kind of celebration that happens when people are truly proud of what they've built together. Later, after everyone had gone home, I stood alone in the conference room watching the city lights come on. My reflection in the window showed a man who looked older than he had 3 years ago, but also more confident, more settled, more certain about who he was and what he was worth. My phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "How did the signing go?" "Perfect," I typed back. "Coming home now." "Proud of you," she replied. "Always." I turned off the lights and locked the office, thinking about the man I'd been when this whole story started. The man who'd believed that loyalty and hard work would automatically be rewarded. The man who'd trusted that merit would speak for itself. That man hadn't been wrong to believe those things. He'd just been naive about how the world actually worked. He'd learned the hard way that integrity isn't always rewarded, that politics often matters more than performance, and that sometimes the people in charge care more about control than competence. But he'd also learned that none of that has to define your story. He'd learned that being pushed out of the wrong place can lead you to the right place. He'd learned that sometimes the worst thing that happens to you becomes the catalyst for the best thing you ever do. The parking garage was quiet as I walked to my car, my footsteps echoing off concrete walls. 3 years ago, I'd made the same walk in defeat, replaced and humiliated at my own celebration. Tonight, I was making it in triumph, having just signed the biggest deal in my company's history. The difference wasn't luck. It wasn't connections or timing or any of the other factors people use to explain away success they can't understand. The difference was a choice. The choice to build something better rather than accept something broken. The choice to tell the truth rather than participate in lies. The choice to bet on myself rather than wait for someone else to recognize my value. It had been the hardest choice and the best choice and, ultimately, the only choice that mattered. As I drove home through the city streets, I thought about Martin Langford sitting in a federal prison cell, probably still convinced that he was the victim of an ungrateful employee's betrayal. I thought about Cameron, building a new life based on principles his father had never understood. I thought about Russell and all the other clients who'd chosen to work with us because they valued honesty over convenience. But mostly, I thought about tomorrow, about the team we were building, the clients we were serving, and the company we were creating, about the possibility that our best days were still ahead of us. Revenge, I'd learned, wasn't a moment. It wasn't a single devastating blow that destroyed your enemies and restored your honor. Real revenge was a process. It was the steady, patient work of building something so successful that your former oppressors became irrelevant to your story. It was the satisfaction of knowing that while they were dealing with the consequences of their choices, you were prospering because of yours. It was the ultimate victory, not just beating them, but outgrowing them completely. And as I pulled into my driveway and saw the lights on in my house, where my family was waiting to hear about my day, I realized that the best revenge of all was simply being happy. Happy with the work I was doing, happy with the people I was working with, happy with the man I'd become through the process of refusing to accept less than I deserved. The champagne had gone flat 3 years ago. The confetti had been swept up and thrown away. The cake with my name on it had been eaten by people who'd watched me get replaced without saying a word. But I was still here, still building, still succeeding. And that, more than any dramatic confrontation or public humiliation, was the sweetest revenge of all.